Echo My Place down to the dirt with more teachable moments from the fire, now streaming from TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, Threads, LinkedIn, and Blue Sky. In Los Angeles, I'm David Brancaccio. It's the Marketplace Morning Report. From APM, American Public Media.
Clay Today is a multimedia publication offering Clay County residents information on news, sports, business, and community updates. More information and details at claytodayonline.com or claytoday904 on Instagram. The North Florida TPO is committed to shaping our transportation future. We're focused on planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, connected community. Learn more at northfloridatpo.com. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
Good morning, I'm Ann Schindler. On today's First Coast Connect, Defiance. We talk to the author of a new book about the power of no and learning to speak up when it matters. Then, a creative partnership that marries live music and live movement. We preview a joint performance of the Jacksonville Symphony and the Florida Ballet. And trees are the inspiration for a local artist, as well as the historic Mandarin Arts Festival showcasing her work. Join the conversation. Give us a call at 904-549-2937. You can also email First Coast Connect at wjct.org or tag us on social media. It's all ahead this hour after the day's news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Corva Coleman. U.S. Senator Chris Van Hollen is in El Salvador. He says that Salvadoran officials have refused his request to release a man mistakenly deported from Maryland to a Salvadoran prison. NPR's Claudia Grisales has more.
Senator Chris Van Hollen, a Maryland Democrat, said the Salvadoran vice president also refused his request to visit with Gilmar Armando Abrego Garcia. Regardless, Van Hollen said more U.S. officials will travel to fight for his release.
I may be the first United States senator to visit El Salvador on this issue, but there will be more, and there will be more members of Congress coming.
Van Hollen argued against the administration's claims that Abrego Garcia has ties to gang activity. He was granted protection from deportation by a judge in 2019. The administration admitted in legal proceedings the deportation was a mistake, but have since refused a Supreme Court decision upholding an order they must facilitate the man's return. Claudia Grisales, NPR News.
A day after NPR broke the story on a whistleblower's concerns about DOJ's activities at his federal agency, several DOJ representatives visited that agency's headquarters. NPR's Jenna McLaughlin has more.
In recent days, a whistleblower working in the IT department of a small independent federal agency filed an official disclosure with Congress and spoke to NPR. Daniel Baroulis works for the National Labor Relations Board, which protects employees' rights to unionize. He says DOJ requested the highest level access right before a large chunk of data was removed from the system. The NLRB told NPR that it never authorized access to the systems. Then, a day later, senior officials at NLRB sent an email obtained by NPR, revealing that DOJ had made its first official visit to the agency, and that 2 DOJ representatives will be working there part-time. NLRB says they will comply with DOJ's requests, but will remove personal data from records before sharing them. Jenna McLaughlin, NPR News.
Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell says the central bank needs more clarity on the effects of President Trump's new tariffs. Speaking in Chicago, Powell says that at some point, consumers will feel their effects too.
Tariffs are highly likely to generate at least a temporary rise in inflation. The inflationary effects could also be more persistent. Avoiding that outcome will depend on the size of the effects, on how long it takes for them to pass through fully to prices, and ultimately on keeping longer-term inflation expectations well anchored.
President Trump is vexed. Writing online, Trump claims that Powell is, quote, too late and wrong. Trump claims the U.S. is getting rich on tariffs, but he cited no evidence. The president also says that the Fed chair's, quote, termination cannot come fast enough. You're listening to NPR News.
You're listening to WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. Good morning, I'm Stephen Ponson. It's 9:04. CSX Railroad's profit fell 27% in the first quarter as two major construction projects contributed to a drop in shipments. Jacksonville-based CSX is in the middle of expanding a key tunnel in Baltimore and repairing lingering damage from last year's hurricanes. The railroad says it earned $646 million or 34 cents per share in the first quarter. That's 3 cents less per share than experts predicted. A bill to bring more transparency to university presidential searches passed overwhelmingly in the Florida House. Chris Young reports the bill's sponsor says the current search process creates mistrust.
House Bill 1321 would remove the public records exemption for applicants to be president of Florida's public colleges and universities. Bill's sponsor, Republican Representative Michelle Salzman, argues that it brings the presidential selection process back into the sunshine.
They put the entire process in the shade, and it created a huge level of distrust amongst Floridians across the state.
Currently, the law allows presidential searches to be mostly confidential, but it's drawn controversy. For example, former University of Florida President Ben Sasse was announced as the only finalist for the role and later investigated for unnecessary spending. The bill passed 104-8 in the House. The Senate version is still going through subcommittees. I'm Chris Young.
Governor Ron DeSantis spoke out against the bill, calling it the Make Universities Woke Again Act. Highs in the low to mid-80s inland today.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Charles Schwab, offering investors choices like full-service wealth management, advice, investing, and trading on Thinkorswim. Learn more at schwab.com. And from the Doris Duke Foundation.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Good morning. I'm Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, when defiance is better than compliance, we talk to the author of a new book about learning to stand firm in the face of injustice and wrongdoing. Later in the program, the music of Ravel and Tchaikovsky meet classical ballet in a collaboration by two Jacksonville cultural mainstays. But first, just how often do you hold your tongue, shut your mouth, or just go along to get along? If you're like a lot of people, you've probably been taught that compliance is a kind of courtesy. But my guest says no, and it's a word she'd like you to learn as well. Dr. Sunita Saw, author of Defy, The Power of No in a World That Demands Yes, joins me now. She's an award-winning professor at Cornell University and an expert in organizational psychology. Dr. Saw, thank you so much for being here.
It's wonderful to be here, Anne.
So no is one of the shortest and simplest, frankly, clearest words in the English language. Why is it so hard for people to say?
It's hard for a number of reasons. What I found in my research is that we feel enormous pressure to go along with what other people want from us. So that's one reason. Another two reasons are that we don't really understand what compliance and defiance actually are, and we've misunderstood a lot about that. And then the third reason is that once we decide to defy, we often don't know how. We don't have the skill set because all our lives, a lot of us have been trained for compliance. We've been trained to be good, to do what we were told, and to fit in, not question authority. And so we don't know how to say no. We haven't ever practiced it.
And you talk about pressure. In your book, you give some really extraordinary examples of pressure to obey. And one of them is an experiment that a lot of people will be familiar with that took place at Yale back in 1961. Can you remind us a little bit about the parameters of this research that was being done by Stanley Milgram? He was sort of interested in why people during World War II committed atrocities without question.
Exactly, yes. So he was really fascinated, Stanley Milgram, with why people just use the phrase, I was just following orders, and whether that really is a psychological reality for most people or not. And so he set up this experiment where he invited members of the community to come in to take part in a learning experiment at Yale. And what he presented the experiment as was, does harming someone with electric shocks actually help them learn more? Does it increase memory? And so what happened was that the people would come in and they would meet what they thought was another participant, but that person was actually an actor who was taken to a separate room and strapped into what they thought looked like an electric chair. And the actual participant would be sat in another room and would read out some word pairs to what they called the learner in the other room. And if the learner couldn't repeat back the correct word pairs, then they would have to deliver a shock on this machine. Now, no shock was actually being delivered, but the participants didn't know that. And they had to start with 15 volts, which was quite harmless. They had felt it themselves in the setup, but the box that they were using to pull the levers to give the shocks went up to a very dangerous 450 volts that was marked with XXX, severe danger. And they also knew that the learner had a heart condition. And what happened was that most people predicted, there were some psychiatrists that made a prediction early on that most people would not continue after 150 volts. And less than 4% would continue after 300 volts, when the learner would start pounding on the room, and then often no further questions would be, no further answers would be completely silent. And they predicted only in about 1 in 1,000 would go up to 450 volts. But what Milgram found was that every single participant pulled the lever for 150 volts. Every single participant pulled the lever for 300 volts. And 65% went up to the deadly 450 volts. So that was a high level of compliance with something, just telling someone to harm another person and telling them to continue, that the experiment requires you to continue, that people would obey.
And we know that experiment has since been replicated. It is a really shocking outcome. There were a few points at which the participants who believed that they were delivering these shocks were weighed their concerns. Some of them objected. Some of them objected more than once. Can you kind of explain what happened and what lessons were drawn from those results?
Absolutely. So when I said 65% went up to 450 volts, what Milgram did was that he called those subjects, those 65 that pulled the lever for 450 volts, the obedient subjects, and those that didn't, the defiant subjects. So now we see a little bit of that reframing of defiance as actually being a positive thing. Yeah, you are not going to harm someone else because you're defying the experimenter. But when you looked at the people, even the people that went up to 450 volts, they were actually showing signs of tension. So you would see some nervous laughter, some stuttering, some stammering, some swearing, people asking whether this was okay. Was the learner okay? They're not answering back. So they were trying to protest in a little way. They just didn't know how exactly to say, no, I'm not going any further. I'm not going to do this. And the experimenter in the room, if the participant protested, had 4 prompts. So if they asked any questions or expressed any concerns, they would just, first of all, say simply, please go on. If after that a teacher protested again, they would say, the experiment requires you to continue. The 3rd prompt was, it's absolutely essential that you continue. And the 4th prompt was, you have no choice. Now, if the teacher, the participant, still protested after the fourth prompt, then the experiment would end and they wouldn't have to give any more prompts. So they really had to stick to saying, I don't want to do this, so several times, and override the experimenter asking them to continue, telling them that they don't have a choice.
So you say in your book that it is appropriate to redefine how we think about defiance. What is an appropriate definition of, what is the current definition of defiance, and what do you think it ought to be? Absolutely.
So let me just take a step back, think about, what do we mean by compliance and defiance? When I grew up, my name Sunita actually in Sanskrit means good, and I mostly lived up to that, but by being good, the messages I received was to fit in, to obey, to be polite, and do as you're told. And when I delved into this more in my research, and I found some serious problems with compliance, one of which is demonstrated in the Milgram experiments, but there's many other problems of people not speaking up when they see something terrible happening, or they even see a mistake. In one survey of over 1,700 crew members on commercial airlines, only about 50% of them spoke up when they noticed an error. So these are situations we do want people to be defiant. We want people to say no. We want people to speak up. And after decades of studying influence, advice, and authority, what I found that is crucial and really changed how I think is that we've just misunderstood what it means to defy. So the current definition in the Oxford English Dictionary is that to defy means to challenge the power of another person, to resist boldly and openly. And I'm not one to usually disagree with the Oxford English Dictionary. I grew up in the UK after all, but I think that definition is too narrow and it doesn't honour our agency. So my definition of defiance is that to defy is to act in accordance with your true values, especially when there is pressure to do otherwise.
And determining those true values is one of the things that you get into in your book, but you also look at a very current example. We talk about this experiment that was done a few decades ago, but you begin your book with a story that is much closer and tragically familiar to all of us, which is the murder of George Floyd. Can you talk about how compliance fits into what we witnessed in that case?
Yes, that image of George Floyd is probably seared in the memory of many people, and it's a horrific image. But what also troubled me with that image is the two rookie cops. There were two rookie cops, one black, one white, one on the third day of their job, one on the fourth day of their job. And they were also very near to George Floyd. And yet when their supervising officer told them to pin George Floyd down, they did. They obeyed, even though one of them asked twice, should we move him onto his side? When they were told no, they continued to obey. Another one checked the pulse twice and saying that there was no pulse, still carried on obeying. And that image really frightened me because I knew how difficult it is to say no. And we can say from a safe distance and from our armchairs that we wouldn't act in that way, or that we would do the right thing if we were caught in a critical moment. But often we freeze, we're unprepared, and we don't know what to do. And as I said, there's immense pressure to go along with others, especially in a work environment where there's a big chain of command or a hierarchical structure. It's very difficult to say no. And then you regret certain things that you do, especially if you know, for example, if your boss asks you to do something unethical and it's very difficult to say no, perhaps everybody else is doing it, how are you going to say no? And we need to be prepared for those situations. But if you were socialized to comply when you were younger, or if the environment is very difficult and presenting a lot of pressure for you to comply with lots of consequences of defiance, we need to be prepared for those moments and know how we're going to respond. We need to be able to connect with our values and to be able to do the right thing. And that preparation and practice comes long before the moment of crisis. We can't just wish ourselves to be defiant in the moment if we've never practiced it.
If you're just joining us, we're talking to Dr. Sunita Saw about her new book, Defy, You can join the conversation by calling us at 904-549-2937. You can also email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org, or you can reach out on social media. We have a call from John in Riverside. Good morning, John. Go ahead.
Good morning. I've read about that experiment where they were giving the shocks, and one of the things that developed defiance is if the person in the white coat that was telling them to do the shocks said to them, "You have no choice, you must." Once they said those words, the people realized, wait, yeah, I do have a choice, and they were more likely not to do it. A similar situation, Korean Airlines were flying airplanes into mountains repeatedly, and they finally determined that the Korean language had too many tenses related to status, and that the co-pilots that were recognizing the pilot was making an error were using deferential tenses that were not assertive enough. They actually had to make them switch to English so that they would, say, "You're flying into a mountain."
Interesting. That's an interesting note, Doctor. So, you talked about how, in a situation that could be very critical, like an airline situation, that there was great reluctance to express concern that an error was being made. But that's also happening in the medical world, right?
That's also happening in the medical world. Like in another survey, 9 out of 10 healthcare workers, most of them nurses, did not feel comfortable speaking up when they saw a colleague making an error. And both of those things, so the Korean co-pilots and other things, it's in places where some deference is expected. And in my research, I've found a psychological process that really contributes to this pressure of not saying anything, to go along with something, to just comply and not reject a suggestion or an order. And I call that psychological process insinuation anxiety. Now, insinuation anxiety is a distinct type of anxiety when we feel concern about rejecting somebody else's advice or not complying with another person's wishes because we don't want it to be interpreted as a signal of distrust. No one wants to imply that their friends, family, colleagues, their boss are doing the wrong thing, that they're incompetent or that they're small-minded or prejudiced. And so we don't want them to think that we think ill of them or that they're making the wrong choice. And so it becomes this charade of good intentions and conditioned politeness that really stifles our true expression of what we really believe. And we become so concerned with offending the other person. I see these relationship concerns even in one-off situations, even with strangers, even when there are no consequences. So insinuation anxiety can be an extremely powerful force that keeps us silent and compliant.
Now, you've said that acts of resistance require practice, that we're sort of wired to comply in a lot of ways, sometimes since childhood, as you mentioned. So what happens neurologically to us when we defy, when we comply, and what are those pathways that we're building when we're practicing?
So if you were socialized to comply as a child and received similar messages to me to be good, which meant to obey, then we almost become, our brain and our neural pathways, it becomes our default response to say yes, to smile, to be polite, to go along with what other people want. So our neural pathways get stronger in those aspects that we really feel that this is the default response. If we don't think about it, we slide into compliance. And so what we do, and compliance is really externally imposed, what somebody else expects us to do, what somebody tells us to do, what society expects us to do, and we go along with that. So when we want to do something different, it feels completely unnatural and we feel uncomfortable to do it. We might fear consequences, but I see it even when there's no consequences because we become so accustomed to saying yes and nodding our head and going along with it and sweeping away any tension or doubt that we have. So what we need to do is start thinking about those situations in advance, because many times we comply in the same type of situation, that we are quiet when somebody says something that you disagree with. So you can anticipate a lot of situations that you might have to defy. I was speaking to one rookie police officer who told me that when they went into the police, when they joined the academy, that they knew that they would be asked to do some unethical things or look the other way, and they had prepared for that. So anticipating is really important, because once you start anticipating, you can visualize it and you can start role playing, even scripting your words out, because you need to get used to saying those things. You need to get your mouth used to saying the words. You need to get your ears used to hearing those defiant words, which could be just as simple as, I'm not comfortable with that. Can you tell me more? Asking for clarification. It's not just confrontation. And so just get used to saying those phrases and taking a step back, the power of the pause. But we do need to practice for it, because if we don't, we'll be returning to our default of compliance. And there's a wonderful quote that's often attributed to Bruce Lee, but was actually a Greek poet, that I always remember in these situations, about the importance of practice. And that is, under duress, we don't rise to the level of our expectations. We fall to the level of our training. So just intellectually understanding, oh, you should speak up when you see something, is not enough. We need the behavioral training. We need to be practicing it so we get used to doing it. And that is the thing that makes the biggest difference, is that practice and preparation.
You tell a really powerful story about being a child with your mother, and that example shows a couple of things. One is sort of the power of preparation. I'll ask you to tell it, but you think that your mother perhaps had some prior experience that led her to the response that she offered, and then also the importance of modeling behavior to children, specifically in this case. Can you tell us about what happened in that case?
Absolutely. So I remember this so vividly. I was a child, about 6 or 7 years old, and I was walking home with my mum from the grocery store, and she was wheeling the shopping cart, which was just like, a rickety cart on 2 wheels. It looks a bit like wheeled luggage. And it was quite a long walk back home, and we decided to go through this, what we call a snicket in Yorkshire in England, which is a narrow alleyway. So we decided to take this shortcut through this alleyway. And my mother, I always thought of her, if you think about compliance and defiance as binary, which I did in those days, and I've realized now that's not true. It's a progression of stages. But she did all the cooking, the cleaning, the grocery shopping, and I had very neatly put her in the compliant box. She served everybody else's need and was very subservient and quiet. But we were walking through that snicket, and that day we were confronted with a group of teenage boys, and they blocked our path, and they started shouting out some things to us, some racist comments, and telling us to go back home. And the other boys were laughing. Now, my mum is petite. She's about 4'8" at the most, and she was wearing her blue-green sari, and she had her hair very neatly tied back in a single plait. And what happened, my reaction to those boys was instant. I grabbed my mother's arm immediately, and I wanted to avert my gaze and just maneuver as fast as possible between the boys and get home. But my mum that day did something different that surprised me. She stopped and she looked at the boys and she said, "What do you mean?" Now, my heart started racing at that point, and I grabbed her arm even tighter, and I said to her, "Come on, Ma." And she said, "No." And she put the shopping cart up vertical. She put one hand on her hip, and she looked directly back at the boys again and said, "What do you mean?" Now, the boys started just looking at each other, and they didn't know what to say. And then one of them said, "Let's go." And they just dispersed. My mum grabbed the shopping cart and she started walking through that snicket really, really fast. But what was interesting, before they dispersed, is when they were very quiet and not saying anything, my mother started looking at them saying, "Oh, you think you're such big, strong boys, tough boys, yes?" And again, they didn't answer her. And I was so shocked that she could tell off a group of boys that were being unpleasant to us in that way. But I think she had seen those boys before, or people like those boys before, and this time decided to do something, whether it was because I was there and she wanted to show me something, or whether she'd had enough of that situation because she would come home muttering. I always thought it was about the shopping cart. I don't know. But that really stayed with me for another number of reasons, because it showed me, first of all, that my compliant mother could do this. Defiance is not a personality. It's actually a skill set, and we can choose to utilize it or not. You can be defiant one day and compliant the next. It's not to do with a character trait or being like this continuously. It's a strategic choice. And also there's a ripple effect, because that affected me. It might change you. I think that defiance transforms us. It makes us more ourselves. It makes us able to live with our authentic values, but it also transforms the people around you, because that really stayed with me. Even though I had such a upbringing in compliance and I saw my mother being so compliant, that one act of defiance really affected me. It's like, we can do it if we really need to.
You teach that there are ways to find an appropriate response, one that is true to your values and that allows you to defy in a constructive way. It involves asking yourself some questions. Can you kind of describe, I think you call it like a defiance compass?
Yes, so there's three main questions in the defiance compass. And the first one is, who am I? So this is work that you can do in advance. And that's really clarifying what your values are, because people often have values, but they don't think about them explicitly unless they're asked to. So I teach executive students at the business school at Cornell, and I have them do this exercise every year, which is to think about their values, why they are important to them, and how they arrived at them. And the reason I do this is because knowing who your values are is really important, because if you write down and explain why your values are important, then your intended behavior is more likely to follow. Because many people will say, for example, one of the values I hear over and over again is integrity. So we prize that value really highly in our culture. We don't want to be known as somebody who cannot be trusted. Integrity and honesty is really important. You don't want to be known as a liar. And in fact, when I ask my students, first of all, to rate themselves on a scale of 0 to 100 as to how honest they are relative to other people in the room, you can guess what they say. Every year it's 85% or above, right? They rate themselves very high on that scale, even though if you are rating yourself relative to other people in the room, half the class needs to be below 50. But we really value that. And the values that I see coming up time and time again, like, boil down to very simple words: integrity, compassion, fairness, justice. These are the things that come up. So who am I is the first question on the defiance compass. Then you look outwards at the environment and you ask yourself, what type of situation is this? That's the second question. So first of all, you need to assess the situation. Is it going against my values? Would it be safe for me to speak up? Would it be effective for me to speak up? Because you want to know what the costs are of defiance and make a clear judgment about whether this is the right time and place to defy. And then the third question is, what does a person like me do in a situation like this? Now, this is a very important question, because this closes the gap between our stated values and our behavior, because we might think of ourselves as having a lot of integrity, but when it comes down to it, we fail to enact those values on a day-to-day basis. And so we want to tap into our aspirational selves and asking yourselves, what does a person like me with these values of integrity, of fairness, what do I do in this situation? And so we really think about, what is it I would like to do? So you're connecting with your responsibility and your ability. You're not like getting rid of your responsibility or thinking somebody else should take care of it. You're really connecting with those values again. You do need the ability to defy, the skill set that I was talking about at that point. But you first of all need to connect to your values and your responsibility to defy, because what you do in that situation goes back to the first question, because it affects who you are. How you act affects who you are. So if you want to live your life in alignment with your values, you have to know how to defy in certain situations and ask yourself, what does a person like me do in a situation like this?
a fascinating question. This is the author of Defy. Her name is Dr. Sunita. She is exploring the power of no in a world that demands yes. I would like to take a couple of calls and emails. We have Charles on the west side. Good morning, Charles. Go ahead.
Good morning, Dr. Saw and Ann. I had a experience in my office several years ago where the fire alarm went off and nobody left. Everybody just sat around looking at each other, and I piped up finally and said, folks, fire alarm, I'm leaving. And some people looked at each other, and after I walked out of the room, then a few people followed me. And how can you explain that, where people are reluctant to get up and leave for something as obvious as a fire alarm?
Mm-hmm. Dr. Saw?
Yes, absolutely. People are, this is what we call the bystander effect too. You think something's wrong, but you're looking around, you're wondering what other people are going to do and following their actions rather than really thinking like you did, oh, this is a fire alarm, we should go. But sometimes we look for leaders in those situations that we're unsure about. You see the same type of thing if somebody is lying on the floor on the street. It's called the bystander effect as well, that many people will just walk on by unless they see maybe somebody else saying, actually, this is an emergency, we need to help this person. So it becomes another reason why we don't do what we think is the right thing to do in that situation, which is, oh, the fire alarm, we should go. A lot of it comes down to our training as well, where we train to just follow a leader and look at what they're saying, or were we trained to recognize this is a fire alarm and I should go out? So thinking about what we've been trained for is really helpful for us to be able to question what is the right thing to do in this situation? What is the most productive thing? What is the safe thing sometimes to do in this situation?
We have a question from Paul from email. He says, we human beings want to believe that we are innately kind and fair. What experiments like the one discussed this morning prove is that we are actually wicked and willing to harm our fellow human beings at the nearest request. This is a great lesson for the current events we are living through now. What are the connections to the current mood, if you will, when it comes to the lessons that you're trying to teach people in your book, Defy? I mean, there is obviously a lot of pressure on some people right now to comply or to perhaps self-censor or to perhaps go along so as not to get into the crosshairs of, anyone in a powerful position. Are there some parallels? Are there some lessons that we should take?
They absolutely are. So just coming back to, Milgram as well in the experiment, he sort of used the word moral imbeciles to describe some of the people that were obedient here in this situation. And realizing the email, it also said wicked. I actually have a more optimistic view because when we look at those people, many of them are not sort of saying, oh, yes, I'm going to pull the lever for 450 volts. Yes, I'm going to harm someone else. They're actually showing signs of tension, as I mentioned. They're sort of nervous, they're sweating. And what that really shows us is some hope for a couple of reasons. One is that it's just showing these people actually wanted to do Defy. They just didn't know how to do it. And as I've said, it's a skill set. It's a practice, not a personality. So even if compliance has been your default, it doesn't need to be your destiny. We can learn how to defy. So that's really, really important lesson for us because we don't want to be in that situation where somebody is telling you to harm someone else, kill somebody else almost, and we're going along with it when we don't want to. That tension is extremely important because it's a warning sign. If you're going to just willingly give your power and all your agency to someone else, you wouldn't have any tension. You would just go along with it and say, yes, of course. But that's not what I see in many people, is that I see these signs of tension. And what we need to do in these situations where we think things are going terribly wrong, or, we need to take a stand, or we have these values and they're being compromised, whether it be at work or in society, we need to recognize that tension, and it can manifest in different ways for different people, but we need to recognize it and not sweep it under the carpet or think somebody else knows better. And we need to think about it and really connect with what are my values. And once we can do that and acknowledge that we're feeling that tension, this might be a situation in which we can defy. So I think it's an essential skill to learn, especially in times where we're getting asked to comply with things that we don't agree with.
I think it perhaps offers some understanding too of people. I mean, you talk about insinuation anxiety in the context of people who may not feel comfortable saying to their hairdresser, that they don't like the way that the hairdresser is doing their hair. To think that, if you feel that, if you've experienced that you would somehow behave differently in a situation, it requires some understanding.
Yeah, so knowing these terms, being able to name these terms, use the power of the pause before you obey quickly. And I know, yes, if you're like me at the hairdressers and they're saying, trust me, and then they give you a cut that you don't like, you probably thank them and maybe even tip them and walk out. But in certain situations, it can be insinuation anxiety for sure, but there's also a fear of the consequences. And we think a lot about that. We often think about what are the costs of defiance? Is it safe? Is it effective? They're two questions that we ask. And sometimes we feel it might not be physically safe or financially safe, or there's going to be some retribution if we defy. So we need to think about those costs, but we also need to think about the costs of compliance. And this is what is often neglected. This is what I often see, is that people focus a lot on the costs of defiance, but they don't think about the costs of compliance. And that's really very important, because if we disregard our values, they're the things that matter the most. And if we disregard them, it can have effect on us, of course, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, but also physically. If we're chronically complying to things that that fundamentally goes against our deepest values, then we experience chronic dissatisfaction, burnout, inauthenticity, and stress, inflammation, all of these things that really take its toll if you're constantly bowing your head to other people and going against what you think is the right thing to do. So connecting with your values is really important. And what I find is that if you can do that and reach the final stage of defiance, which is actually saying no, a lot of that tension that you feel right at the very beginning in that first stage that I mentioned, that tension dissipates, it melts. And we can think, oh, we're living a more honest life, a more authentic life, one that I'm proud of because I'm being my aspirational self. I'm connecting with my values and I'm acting in alignment with those values.
Dr. Sunita Saw, she's the author of Defy, The Power of No in a World That Demands Yes. It was wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much for being here today. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to talk to you.
Coming up next, a creative partnership that marries live. The past 3 years, the Jacksonville Symphony and the Florida Ballet have forged a dynamic artistic alliance, collaborating in performances, blending sound and movement. Joining me to discuss their latest venture is Roberto Forleo, Artistic Director for the Florida Ballet. Welcome back, Roberto.
Hi, thank you.
And Courtney Lewis, Music Director for the Jacksonville Symphony. Good morning, Courtney.
Hi, Anne. It's great to see you.
Great to see you, too. Can you tell us a little bit about how this partnership began in the first place? Was it between the two of you? Was it your institutions?
Roberto, I think that might be best coming from you because it was one of my colleagues who started the collaboration with you.
Correct. Yeah. So we started right before COVID. It was my first year when I joined Jacksonville and the Florida Ballet. So we started with, the collaboration started with Tony Nicol, which is the vice president and the artistic administrator. So from there, then we developed this collaboration, which had a pause during 2 years, right?
Like everything.
Yes. Like our first collaboration was January 2020.
Oh, wow.
And then nothing for 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then we started back with Symphony in 60s in the fall 2022.
And so what was the idea? Was it that there are kind of some communal areas between your audiences? Was it the desire to just sort of build on this, cultural capital that you each have?
Yeah, I think it was the desire to join these two organizations and these two art forms together and bring communities together. So usually, maybe people, they go to the symphony, not necessarily come to see the ballet, and vice versa. So the idea is actually to bring people together in one place and to see beautiful music and dancing.
Yeah, and so that's how it started. Courtney, how's it going? I mean, let's see kind of how it's progressed to this point.
Well, I think just to add to that, one of the things that we really wanted to do was to help the Florida Ballet, because what Roberto has achieved in such a remarkably short time is really incredible. This institution that is now producing so many wonderful things, and we really wanted to help and be a part of that. So there have been lots of different productions. Personally, we too have done a Symphony in 60 in which we played the Tchaikovsky, a suite from Tchaikovsky, which was then danced. And we also collaborated at our Gala this year, where we had members of the ballet dancing alongside some of our numbers. But there have also been complete productions, like a whole brand new production of Dracula, which Roberto choreographed to a selection of different classical musics. And in a couple of weeks, we have another Symphony in 60 coming up, which will focus on the music of Antonin Dvorak, the Serenade for Strings in E minor, which will also be choreographed. And it's a really fascinating process from a conductor's point of view to get to know a piece. But then when you collaborate with dancers, you have a whole extra element to consider, because we won't necessarily be going at the tempos that I'm used to conducting the piece, because the dancers have got a million things to do in every beat. So the conductor is, for once, not the kind of be-all, end-all dictator of all things musical in this kind of collaboration. And that's a very interesting dynamic, and one from which a conductor can learn a lot, because an enormous amount of classical music is based on dance forms. If you go back to some of the earliest instrumental music by Bach, the first orchestral suites, the title of every movement is a dance, a jig or a bourrée, and the influence of dance throughout even abstract forms of classical music that aren't usually danced to is really enormous.
Interesting. I mean, where was that thread lost, where it kind of became more about watching a musical performance as opposed to seeing it performed with music or interpreted through dance?
Well, it wasn't necessarily that the music was danced to at the beginning. It's just that composers looked to dance forms to characterize their music. And even up in Mozart and Haydn symphonies, you have a minuet as the third movement, but with Beethoven it begins to disappear. But even as we go into the 20th century, lots of 20th century composers like Stravinsky and Britten and Prokofiev all reached to dance forms to inspire their music.
Yeah, and so when you're conducting, do you get some additional energy from having the dancers there with you? And I mean, I know you say sometimes it affects the rhythm, but how does it affect your overall kind of?
Well, I'm usually trying not to sort of ogle these gorgeous men who are flying across the stage with no shirts on. No, it does, because you're aware of the fact that things have to happen whilst you're conducting.
Yeah.
And often they're behind me, so I don't necessarily see a whole lot, but I can hear it's like a troop of elephants behind me. It doesn't look like a troop of elephants, but it sounds like one behind me. More so in feedback from Roberto when I stop, and particularly in tempo, because often Roberto will have choreographed to a particular recording, which is one tempo, which might not be mine. So there has to be a lot of flexibility in that.
Yeah, and how do the dancers receive it, Roberto? How do they enjoy performing to a live symphony like this?
I think they love it, and it's something very important for them to do, because it makes your ear much more sensitive to the music. So you're not just dancing every single time to the same tempo. With the live music, it's flexible,
slight variation,
because it's a live concert, and the dancers as well. It's not every night is going to be the same for the music or for the dancers. They're not going to dance exactly the same every single night.
And so how do you choose what you're going to perform to? How do you pick the musical selections? And tell us a little bit more. This upcoming one is Dvorak?
Yes.
Okay.
Do you want to start that one?
Sure. Well, for this one, we were looking into a string orchestra, so we could give a little bit more space to the dancers to perform.
Okay.
Because usually we use the full orchestra, so that narrow the choice of music. And I think that Dvorak, it was so beautiful that I thought it was a great choice for the Symphony in 60s.
Yeah.
We should say that in Jacobi Symphony Hall, we have a spectacular acoustic classical music hall, not designed for ballet. And we've had a few hairy moments where we've had the full orchestra on stage and dancers have come perilously close to first violins.
Yeah.
Wow.
So we decided that we'd try this time to have a smaller orchestra just to give them a bit more room.
That's exciting. So just in the little bit we have left, tell us, first of all, there is a couple events in May. May 22nd, there's the Symphony in 60, which is a real popular event, especially among young people. And then there's a matinee performance on the 23rd.
That's right. So that's the one we were just talking about. That's May 22nd, which is a Thursday. Symphony in 60, which is at 6:30. That's an hour-long performance. And then it's repeated the following morning at 11 o'clock a.m.
All right. And there are tickets available. jacksymphony.org is the place to get them or to get more information. Courtney Lewis, Roberto Forleo, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
All right. Up next, meet the artist turning metal and wood into miniature masterpieces.
Let's play.
As the crack of the bat echoes across blooming fields, Film at WJCT Studios presents a heartwarming celebration of America's favorite pastime. April 30th, we're hosting a special screening of Ephus, a charming indie gem that captures the spirit of community, nostalgia, and the magic of the game. With humor and heart, Ephus is a tender tribute to the game, the people who play it, and the moments that make life meaningful. Visit WJCT.org/film for tickets.
On the next Fresh Air, Americans starving in jail. New Yorker staff writer Sarah Stillman reports on the shocking number of people who've died of starvation or dehydration in county jails, often mentally ill people arrested for minor crimes. She finds many of the deaths occur in counties where private companies are providing correctional health services. Join us
today at noon on WJCT News 89.9.
Where have all the male teachers gone?
As a guy, if it comes to clothes, ask them to go to the clinic. Sometimes as a guy, you will be perceived as naturally angry. Having those little itty-bitty pieces on male teachers' plates drive them to leave.
How do we get them back in the classroom? It's the latest in our series, Falling Behind, the Miseducation of America's Boys. That's on the next On Point.
Today at 11 on WJCT News 89.9.
Life after being laid off can be challenging. Tens of thousands of federal employees have lost their jobs since Donald Trump took office as president. But they're not alone. How do you handle a layoff and the emotional and mental toll it can take? We share your stories and advice for those looking to write their next chapter next time on 1A.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. Well, the Mandarin Art Festival has been an Easter weekend tradition since 1968, and while the event has grown up, it retains its small-town character and, of course, its signature oak trees defining the community. Join me to tell us about it is the event's chairperson, Susie Scott. Good morning, Susie.
Good morning. Happy to be here.
Happy to have you. We're also joined by featured artist Christine Boris. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, Susie, first of all, you were just saying to me that this is the longest-running art festival in the area?
Longest running in Northeast Florida, yes. Founded in 1968 and keeps growing steadily year after year.
It's extraordinary. And it is a success because, in part because it keeps growing. Every year there is always something new to check out, new artists, new offerings, new pavilions of
exactly
stuff.
This year we have over 50 new artists, amazing range of talent from all of them. So we're excited to bring them to Jacksonville and bring them to the Mandarin Art Festival as new exhibitors.
This is a juried festival. This is not something that just it takes all comers.
It takes the comers that are juried in and qualified. There's very high standards, obviously, in order to maintain a show of this quality. But there's 6 categories, and all of them make the criteria to participate, and we welcome them to be a part of this show and help us grow and help us show our excellence. We are one of the few remaining juried fine art and fine craft shows. Most festivals are kind of morphing into something a little different with food and with music. But we're kind of true to our particular origin, which is fine art and fine craft.
Right. And so this is a festival and it has the atmosphere of a more perhaps, casual event, but you can get some really extraordinary pieces of artwork.
Exactly. The artists are exhibiting in about 130 booths this year, and they will be coming from all over the country and locally. Many of them are award-winning artists. We have one that we're very excited about this year who does museum quality work, in fact, does museum restoration work. And to have someone like that and apply and be accepted in our show is really a coup for us. We're excited to welcome him.
Of course, one of the artists is Christine Boris, who is here with us, and she does some extraordinary pieces out of wire and other materials, making trees that look kind of like bonsai trees. We have some that we can show, but Christine, while we're taking a look at them for the people who are able to join us on video, tell us a little bit about how you started in this line of work and how these are created, because they're very intricate.
Thank you. Well, people always ask me, what made you start doing this or how'd you start? Actually, it was insomnia. And, but really, I've always had a love for nature. My brother and I used to be climbing trees, making forts and trees our whole life. It was just spending time out in nature. And nature is nourishing in itself, just to be around trees, to be anything live. And so I've always been very crafty with my hands. I've never really worked with wire until about 5 years ago. And one night I just decided to start twisting wire. I said, I think I'll make a tree. And it turned out terrible, of course. But it got me interested in pursuing. So I looked on the internet and there were people making wire trees. So I started picking up little techniques, doing my own thing, a lot of trial and error. And so I used 20 gauge colored aluminum wire. I found a wire I really like. And then each tree is different. And I try to specialize. I like making custom work now because I've developed not only from all wire trees, but now I use multimedia where I use wire and clay and real tree pieces like pentas and zecum to make a tree that looks very realistic. And I like making trees that are almost famous trees. We have a treaty oak.
That's right. One of the ones that we're looking at just a moment ago there is this replica treaty oak. And it is, I mean, of course, if people haven't been to the treaty oak downtown, it is a beautiful tree to see. But this is a miniature version of it. And it's very accurate and very, I guess it must take an extraordinary amount of time to do.
Those trees take a long time because they start off with wire and clay and to build the armature, which is the base. And then that has to dry and more layers and then painting. And yeah, that particular treaty oak took about 2 months to make, just in between drying time and all the different applications that I had to do.
Is it a sort of a meditative skill like we think of bonsai tree, maintenance?
Absolutely, because it is kind of mindless when you're working with, especially the all wire trees are definitely mindless. But with that, you have to have a vision, but they all take on a mind of their own. When I'm making them, sometimes I go, that wasn't supposed to be there, but it's going to be there now. It's like a real tree. When you cut a branch, it takes on its own shape. And that's actually what happens when I make, there's no two alike because of that. And I might start off wanting to make a red tree with a brown bark, and it ends up being a purple tree with white bark. Just how the shape is, it's just they're again, they take on their own personality.
An enormous variety. And it's cool, Susie, because obviously Mandarin's known for its trees, its oak trees in particular, but that is a signature. This event is annual benefit to the Mandarin Community Club. Can you just briefly tell us why how it helps sustain the club?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The Mandarin Community Club was founded in 1923, but the building is one of the most historic in all of Jacksonville, founded by Harriet Beecher Stowe, the famed author. And the Community Club serves Mandarin and has since 1923. And this is our primary fundraiser. It's a great Mandarin tradition, grows every year. We'll have 6,000 to 10,000 people over Easter weekend.
Wow. Well, it is the Mandarin Arts Festival. It's April 19th and 20th. It's 10 to 5 on the Saturday and 10 to 4 on the Sunday. Thank you both so much for being here. Susie Scott, Christine Boris, appreciate it.
Welcome. Please come.
All right. And that's our program. Thank you for listening. If you have comments or questions, you can send either to First Coast Connect at WJCT.org. Please join us tomorrow when our panel of journalists discusses all the week's headlines, from the latest on a jail death to how AI is helping to shape the city's budget. I'm Ann Schindler. You've been listening to First Coast Connect on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
Congaree & Pen, dedicated to agriculture and culinary endeavors, offering field-to-fork dining and outdoor experiences on over 300 acres. Sip, dine, explore. Information at congareeandpen.com. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. The North Florida TPO is dedicated to transportation planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, resilient, and connected region. More information available at northfloridatpo.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
It's happened to tens of thousands of federal workers already this year, and the pain's set to continue. What happens when you get laid off, and how do you bounce back? From WAMU and NPR in Washington, this is 1A. Hi, I'm Nyla Boodoo. Federal workers are in the spotlight right now, but we know layoffs can happen to anyone. It can, of course, mean financial anxiety, but it can also affect how we see ourselves and our relationship to work. How can we manage layoffs and take care of our mental health? We get advice from experts, and we'd love to share your story. How did you cope after being laid off? What effect did it have on you and your family? Email us at 1a@wamu.org or leave us a message on the 1A Vox Pop app. All of that coming up after the news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Corva Coleman. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni will be meeting President Trump at the White House today. Their visit will be the first time Trump's met with a European leader since he announced tariffs on European imports. NPR's Deepa Shivaram reports.
Tariffs are expected to be a main part of the conversation between Meloni and Trump, who have an amicable relationship. Meloni, head of the right-wing Brothers of Italy party, was the only leader to attend Trump's inauguration this year. But relations with Europe have been tense after Trump announced 20% tariffs on European imports, which he then reduced to 10% to allow for negotiations to take place. Meloni last visited Trump at his Florida home in January, and she's set to host Vice President J.D. Vance in Italy in the coming days. Deepa Shivaram, NPR News, the White House.
U.S. District Judge James Boasberg says the Trump administration is likely in criminal contempt. The judge says the administration has purposely ignored his order to turn around planes deporting migrants to El Salvador last month. Medications known as GLP-1 have revolutionized the way the doctors treat weight loss. That started largely with Ozempic. It's Novo Nordisk's blockbuster diabetes drug. But most of the current options on the market are injectables. These can be intimidating for patients to use. NPR's Sydney Lepkin reports a new GLP-1 pill is now on the horizon.
Eli Lilly is announcing that early results from a phase 3 clinical trial of its GLP-1 pill show it reduced participants' A1C, a measure of blood sugar control, better than placebo. The trial lasted 40 weeks and was only for people with type 2 diabetes. According to the company, the safety and efficacy was consistent with its injectable GLP-1 drugs, Zepbound and Mounjaro. The once-daily pill also helped patients lose up to 16 pounds. The company plans to report the results at the American Diabetes Association conference and publish them in a peer-reviewed medical journal later this year. Sydney Lupkin, NPR News.
Stocks opened mixed this morning as President Trump attacked the Federal Reserve for not lowering interest rates. NPR's Scott Horsley reports the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell more than 400 points in early trading.
The European Central Bank lowered interest rates today, and President Trump would like the Federal Reserve to take similar action. Of course, political leaders in Europe have not launched a trade war, which threatens to raise prices for their citizens. Fed Chairman Jerome Powell warned in a speech this week that Trump's new tariffs are highly likely to generate at least a temporary rise in inflation. That's discouraging the Fed from cutting interest rates any further. This is not the first time Trump has criticized the Fed for keeping borrowing costs elevated. He says Powell's termination administration, quote, cannot come fast enough. Powell has insisted he plans to serve out his term as Fed chairman, which runs through next spring. Scott Horsley, NPR News, Washington.
On Wall Street, the Dow is now down 424 points. The Nasdaq is up about 30 points. This is NPR. U.S. Senator Patty Murray of Washington State says that Head Start centers across the country have not been able to get $1 billion in federal funding they're owed. The Democratic senator says some Head Start preschool classrooms are now closed. Murray charges the Trump administration is slow-walking the money. Head Start is a child development program for the nation's poorest children. Research has shown that in many age groups, men drink more alcohol than women. A new study suggests that in one category of young women, aged 18 to 25, women are drinking more like their male peers. NPR's Katie Riddle reports on the study from the Journal of the American Medical Association.
Researchers define binge drinking as 5 drinks in one occasion for men and 4 for women. Bryant Shuey is a professor of medicine at University of Pittsburgh and one of the authors of this study.
We're seeing the gap in binge drinking between females narrowing across all adults, with young adult females binge drinking at a higher rate than their male counterparts for the first time.
Roughly 31% of young women indicated binge drinking in the last month compared to 30% of males. Shuey points out that overall, younger people have been drinking less in recent years. This study just shows that younger men and women have similar drinking patterns. Katie Riddle, NPR News.
2 New York corrections officers have pleaded not guilty to murder charges. It's in connection with the beating death of a prisoner last month. This happened while some New York State prison guards were staging an unapproved strike. I'm Corva Coleman, NPR News, from Washington.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Lilly Endowment, a private foundation supporting NPR's coverage of religion and spirituality, and Jarl and Pamela Mohn, focusing on civil liberties, foster youth, public radio, and the arts.
Tidbits, family owned and operated since 1985, offers